Well, I'm going to introduce myself before we read from the scriptures. I've just moved to Casper on Monday. I drove up from Highlands Ranch, Colorado, which is just south of Denver. That's where I've lived for the last 15 years. And I got a call. We were camping, my husband and I, his name is Bob. We were camping in the Rocky Mountain National Park. And I pulled up, you have to get kind of cell service somewhere, you kind of stand on the top of a mountain. And I looked and I said, Bob, the official from the United Methodist Church wants me to go to Casper, Wyoming. And let me read it to you. And he said, Janet, type yes. I said, don't you want to know what it's about? He said, no, they're inviting us to Casper, Wyoming, just type yes. And I said, but it sounds like they're going to lose Pastor Brian for a while, and they want me to come for about a month. He said, I don't care how long, just say yes. We used to live in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and that's where we fell in love with the wind. And that's why I have this short haircut, and it works really great up here. I was so glad that the wind was blowing today. So we said yes, and I've come to be with you for the next 9 months. It started off that it was going to be 1 to 4 months, give Pastor Brian a time to get well. And then it was decided by the officials of the church that Pastor Brian couldn't get well and take care of a big congregation at the same time. And so he agreed and said it was good for me to get well, and we'll call in the reinforcements. So I am Brian's reinforcement. Amen. Yes, and I am delighted to be here in Casper, Wyoming. We really love Wyoming. I retired 2 years ago, and I've been camping and enjoying life, and so I'm kind of ready to come back and be a part to the real world again. Yes, and pastor a church again. So I'm delighted to be with Pastor Mary and Rosemary and even James Lee. Even Mr. James. My husband's name is Bob. He's still down in Denver. He had some things he had to finish up before he could move. And we have this ancient dog named Chewy. Chewbacca.
Oh, yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Is Chewbacca, that's not live long and prosper. That's, the Force will be with you. That's right. Okay, that's a Jedi. So Chewy is our dog, and he's 18 years old.
Wow.
He can't see, and he can barely hear, but he's got a great nose. So we'll bring him one night and just kind of let him hang out here at King's Corner. So this is my first Sunday here. We drove up on Monday, and I decided that as I drove up, I'm a fisherman. I love to fish, and I especially love to fish rivers. And I was so excited to see the North Platte River. And you catch it somewhere around Wheatland, I'm not really even sure, but you pass it several times and then through several big reservoirs and so forth. I learned to fish on the South Platte down in Colorado, and I can't wait to fish the North Platte and some of these reservoirs. So I'm really into rivers and thought that a river would make sense because rivers talk to me. They talk to me and they tell stories and they tell me about what God is doing, and they run underneath everything and keep us remembering and remembering and remembering. So I thought about what Jesus said. This is in John. Yes, time between times, a river runs through it. This is what Jesus said in the Gospel of John. He said, on the last day of the festival, the great day. Now, this festival is a festival the Jewish people have. It's a harvest festival when they're bringing in all the grain and the harvest. And one of the things that happens on this great day is that they pour water over the altar to help people remember that God provides for those who are thirsty, and to remember that God provided water for the people when they were roaming in the wilderness. So this is what Jesus says. On the last day of the festival, that great day, while Jesus was standing there, he cried out, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me, and let the one who believes in me drink. As the scripture has said, out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water." When I did the children this morning, I said, the friends of Jesus, out of the friends of Jesus will flow blessings, rivers of blessings. Well, as I said, I'm thankful that I was called out of retirement to be here in Casper. You know, when I retired 2 years ago, I was concerned about how I would do in retirement. You know, you don't know after you've worked all your life, when you stop working, how you're going to do, you know, if you're going to go crazy or whatever. And so I remembered a time in the mid-1990s when the bishop, which is our grand poobah who appoints us, when the bishop moved me from a church that I loved in Grand Junction. And I was to go and come to Denver, to the big city, and I was to manage a lot of ministries from Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and Montana. So I would be on the road a lot. I would no longer have a congregation. I would no longer be preaching. And I got kind of depressed, because I was kind of worried about whether I'd be happy. And I thought about all the things that I loved and that I would miss, the losses, like Easter sunrise when it's snowing. Yeah, you know, when it's snowing on Easter morning and everybody's shivering. Yeah. And candles on Christmas Eve, and the little girl that sets the lady's hair on fire in front of her. Yeah, the smell of burning hair on Christmas Eve. It's so lovely. And then when you baptize a baby and you're holding that baby and that water runs over the head, and then you notice all of a sudden that you're kind of wet. And you're not real sure from what from. Those are the simple joys of being a pastor. And I was afraid that I would miss them. And then a friend of mine said, "Well, Janet, you don't have a church of your own. Will you come to Salt Lake City and preach for me one morning?" And I said, "You mean you're going to let me preach for you?" And he said, "Well, sure." I was so overjoyed to get back into a pulpit again that I kissed the man. Uh-oh, yes. He turned red. I know. Robert turned red from the tips of his toes to the top of his bald head. He was rather embarrassed. But then when he found his voice, this is the line. He said, "You know, you don't have to blow in her ear. Just let her preach, and she'll follow you anywhere." So, dear ones of King's Corner, you have let me preach. And so I will hold you in my heart forever. And Mary and I will be here at least for the next little while. Let me see. Will you pray with me? Gracious God, let us be masters of ourselves that we might be servants to others. Take our minds and think through them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hearts and set them on fire. Amen. Well, I have a friend, her name is Sally, and in her office hangs the picture of this charming animal. I call this guy Sally's goat. It is a mountain goat. And Sally, I like this picture because Sally always reminds me to listen to people's emotions when there's a time of great change. Listen to feelings. Pay attention to what people are feeling when there's a great change. And I am full of feelings today, not only because this is my first Sunday here in Casper, but because my family, the Forbes family, lives down east in North Carolina. One set of the family lives on the Cape Fear River near Wilmington, and the other part of the family lives on the Neuse River near New Bern. And it's been a scary time. And it's anxious with Florence. Florence is a name my family is going to remember for years to come. And then I was very aware this morning when I got up to go to church and today that Bob's not here. And I miss Bob. I miss Bob and I miss Chewy. And so I was kind of a little homesick, not for Denver, Heavenly Days, not for Denver, but for Bob and for Chewy. And then I got to feeling really, I know Pastor Brian preached from up here, and that y'all are hurting. He was very present with me all day long, because I preached in his pulpit, I preached in his chancel, and now I'm preaching on his platform. And I know that you miss him, and it's real, and it's very wounding. And I want to pay attention to that, and I want you to pay attention to that. That when you see Brian around town, because he is still in Casper, give him a big hug. Run up and give him a big hug. He needs all the love that we can give him. So I was full of feelings this morning, and so I said, when I looked down, like that goat, it was a long, long way down. Not only do I feel like that goat, but I can recognize the name of the river that's at the bottom of that big cliff. It's the Salmon River in Idaho. Has anybody ever been to the Salmon River in Idaho? Wonderful. It's one of those rivers, it's called the River of No Return. Is that when you put a raft or a canoe into the river, there is no turning around. You are committed. You have to go through the rapids for 200 miles. There's absolutely no place to get out. And the cliffs are 5,000 feet straight up and down. And when you get there, you have to be committed to going. And that's what it kind of felt like, is that change is upon this community with the loss of Brian and me coming, and that sometimes it feels like we're getting in the rapids and riding them, and it's just bucking us, and we can hardly stay on. William Bridges, in his book, it's called Managing Transitions, says that it isn't change that does us in, it's transition, and they're very different. Change is just a situational thing, but transition affects your mind. It's psychological. Transition is a process that we go through to come to grips with a new situation. The first phase of the transition is an ending, a losing, and a letting go, where we deal with the loss. And that's what we're dealing with the loss of Brian and many other losses that may be going on in your life. And it's all about grief and those feelings. It's a roller coaster of feelings, sometimes shock, denial, sadness, anger, blame. That's grief when there's a loss. The second part is called the neutral zone, and I call that the time between times. It's kind of the middle, when the old is gone and the new hasn't been formed yet. And it's the gap. It's that goat hanging in midair. And it feels like that. It feels like you don't have any place to put your feet. The third phase is coming out of the neutral zone, and it's a new beginning. So transition starts with an ending and then ends with a beginning. But transitions usually take about 12 months. So you can't rush them. As the in-between senior minister, I will be with your community for probably about 9 months in the neutral zone. I'll be managing the gap. I'll be with you as the goat. I'll be the goat. And then the higher-ups of the Methodist Church will appoint a new pastor. But that's what we'll be doing together, is that in-between time. Now, I think it was the writer of John who put words in Jesus' mouth about this river of blessings. This festival, this harvest festival, I told you water is poured over the altar, and Jesus then says, I can satisfy anyone's thirst. Out of a believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water. Out of a believer's heart will flow rivers of living water. See, Jesus' Spirit not only fills us up, but it flows out of us. Not only do we receive blessings when we follow Jesus' teachings, but we become blessings to others. And I don't know you very well, but I've seen that already tonight. The first river that's talked about in the Bible is the River Jordan. I don't know if you've heard about that song about the River Jordan is Chile and wide. It was crossed by Joshua when he marched the armies of Israel through it, and then Jesus was baptized in the River Jordan. 6 times I've stood in the River Jordan. I've taken groups to Israel, and I've stood there, and I've baptized people in that cold, cold water, and I've splashed people, Virginia, as they remember their baptism. But that's only one of the rivers in the Bible. The Bible talks about prosperity and blessedness. Isaiah says, I will extend prosperity to her like a river, and the wealth of nations like an overflowing stream. But the Bible also talks about a time when God seems absent and the rivers seem to dry up, where there is, the waters become foul and the fish die and the rushes turn brown. But also the river is a symbol of justice and goodness. Amos cried, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And sometimes, instead of new life, the river is talked about in terms of death and terms of dying, and the songs are full of that. I grew up with the words of a famous song that's Isaac Watts, 200 years old, something, 300 years old. Mary, how old is Isaac Watts? I don't know. But it goes a little bit like this. The first verse starts, you may know this one. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come. And then the fourth verse says, time like an ever-rolling stream bears all its sons away. Hear that image? Hear that image of the river bearing the sons away? And I've discovered it bears the daughters away as well. It's rich, rich symbolism, and I could spend just hours talking about rivers. I could spend hours walking by rivers. But my favorite book is by Norman Maclean, and it's called A River Runs Through It. And it's a story of a family who loves to fish. Do you know that one? My favorite quote from that says, eventually all things merge into one and a river runs through it. And I take this to mean that the river is the thread that connects life, not only connects life, but carries life. And that this movement of life is not random. It's not random. It is directional and it is focused. And it promises that life current is not undercutting of life, but actually uplifting. Rivers uplift. Now, my brother, who lives in New York, he loves a canoe, and he loves to canoe whitewater. And I remember one time he called me, and he had just been on a canoe trip with his family. And it had been a long time since he had been canoeing and had kind of forgotten how to kind of do it. And his daughter was 12, his son was 9, and they got in it and they got out into the Delaware River, and all of a sudden the current of the river took them and turned them backwards. And he's yelling at his 12-year-old daughter, Emma, "Emma, paddle on the right, paddle on the right. Go ahead, paddle on the right. No, 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 stop, paddle on the left, paddle on the left." And so Emma is paddling on the left, and Colin, the 9-year-old, grabs a branch, and he says, "Colin, let go of the branch, we're going to turn over." And I'm listening on the phone and just laughing and laughing, because I have taught many, many teenagers how to canoe a river. And that's exactly the way they do it when they start. They paddle heavy on the right, and then they paddle on the left, and then they get frenzied, and they do this, and they're shouting at one another, and they're cursing. And you know, it doesn't take them very long to realize that if they just relax into the river knows where it wants to go. And the river will take that canoe and guide it. And all they need to do is like one little stroke. Or maybe create a little rudder back there and turn it, and that little canoe will just go. It's called going with the flow. You ever heard that statement? Going with the flow. And it's built upon the recognition that the river will operate in your best interest if you just let it. If you're kicked out of the raft, what do? You turn over on your back, you put your feet up so you bounce off the rocks, and you go with the flow till somebody picks you up. Yeah, the river will take care of you if you just give yourself to it. The river is for you, not against you. So my brother finished his story by saying, "Janet, you're a preacher and you're smart." He said, "What if we actually trusted that the flow of our lives was blessed, that the flow of our lives was for us, not against us, no matter what happens? That the river is for us, not against us." And so I thought about that question, and I thought, what if we were to believe that the Spirit of God is in every movement of our lives, that it flows with us and is for us and not against us? What if we could trust God in the rapids of change as well as in the good times of continuity? What if we could actually trust God in the changes? And what if we could begin to ride the river instead of buck the river when we're getting ready for tomorrow? Every now and then I'll have somebody that comes at me contrary. I call that, Virginia. Some that comes up me and gets in my face, you know, contrary. Yeah, and who's not going with the flow and is actually going against the flow. I had one man come up to me before and he said, "Janet, I don't know what it is about me, but I'm one of those folks that always has to swim upstream." And what I should have said is, you know, if you're swimming against the crowd or the status quo and bringing health, I want to say, good for you. Hang in there. But if you're actually just being stubborn, you are going to miss what's actually happening around you and what God is doing without going with the flow, bucking it. So for me tonight, the flowing river becomes synonymous with the Spirit of God. God is underneath it all, because the Bible talks about God as that wide river, and God is underneath it all. Not our music, not our ministers, not even our families, not our jobs. God is underneath it all. That's what's at the heart of the river. Our search for God and God's search for us, and those surprising moments of connection that are unpredictable sometimes, but are actually change our lives and sustain our lives. I had a lady come up to me last year and she said, "You're a pretty confident young woman." And she didn't mean it as a compliment. Now, look at this face. She said that to me last year. I am neither young nor am I confident. But I used to be young and I used to be confident, but those easy waves that I was riding, I fell off of a long time ago. You know, I thought there were some things that will always work, but they don't. And I thought there were some people who would always be there, and they aren't. And if there was ever a day when I was captain of the currents, that day has passed. Change is a part of life. So when I talk about the river, I'm talking about God's love for us. I'm talking about what's called God's providence, God's care, God's protection, God's presence, which is something that's hard to explain and just has to be trusted. Just has to be trusted. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that there is a thread of meaning that goes through all of the change that we experience. And that thread of meaning will see us through change, through this period of transition and beyond, because God runs through it. God is underneath it all. And it better be God, because the song also says that the river will turn on you. It will. Because there's a song that says the river is chilly and cold. There'll be a time when we'll face that kind of a river. And the invitation is, to kind of be scared. I remember the story of a friend of mine, another pastor, who went to call on a man from his church who was dying. And the man said, he was an elderly man, and he said, "Pastor, the time has come for me to cross the River Jordan." And my friend asked, "Are you afraid to cross the River Jordan?" The man grinned and said, "There's no way I'm afraid." And the pastor said, "Why not?" And this is what that man said. He said, "Because I believe that the Lord owns the land on both sides of that river." On both sides of that river. So, beloved, as we go through change, as we go through the changes here at King's Corner with the loss of Brian and this crazy woman from Denver here, as we go through change, as you go through the changes in your life, changes that happen in your families, changes that happen in work and with your friends, I want us to remember two things. Go with the flow, because God is underneath it all, and use a light touch. Just steer gently and trust that the God of the waters is also the God of the shores, both shores. Amen.